Okay, recording has begun. Welcome to the March 4th edition of the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall. Here is our agenda for today. Critical reasoning, we're looking at two departments, which are find the assumption and strength and weaken. All right, for those of you who don't know, critical reasoning departments, ideally you should be considering each department of critical reasoning as actually a separate type of question. Okay, most people make the mistake of sort of lumping in all critical reasoning question types together, and that's really not such a good idea. So, in other words, find the assumption is so different from strengthen or weaken that they're almost like different types of questions. In other words, you should think of these two as just as different from each other as you would, say, CR and RC. But that's the deal there. And then after that, we're going to close the study hall with, this is a topic that's been deferred from some earlier editions of the study hall, placement of helping verbs in parallel constructions. That's, if you don't know what that means, you'll see when we get to it near the end of the course. Okay, let's start out with some find the assumption type problems. Okay, what I'm going to do first, before we do anything like that, is I'm going to start you off with a very simplistic example here of what finding the assumption is. Let's make sure that we actually know what an assumption is. I mean, that sounds like a very basic thing, but a lot of people really don't have a full grasp of exactly what it means when they say find the assumption. So we're going to start off here with a discussion of, in preface to these problems where we have to find the assumption, exactly what is an assumption. All right, so here's a quick sample passage for you. Let's see what you do with it. All right, so here's a sample passage. It's going to be very short just to make sure that you guys understand what the basis of an assumption is. So James has a low ratio of type 1 to type 2 to type 1 muscle fibers. Therefore, James cannot be an Olympic sprinter. Okay, let's find the assumption here, and I'm going to give you two choices. All right, the first choice for the assumption is Olympic sprinters require a ratio of type 2 to type 1 muscle fibers that is not low. And then assumption 2 is athletes require a ratio of type 2 to type 1 muscle fibers that is not low. For those of you who just got here, we're doing find the assumption in critical reasoning. This is a quick intro before we actually get into the meat of what find the assumption is. Okay, so here's the story. I want you guys to indicate, and I'm going to give you A through C multiple choices. Here's what I want you to indicate. In this quick passage, if you think the first one is only the correct assumption, then pick A. If you think only the second one is the correct assumption, then pick B. If you think either of them is the correct assumption, then pick C. Well, the answer choices, by the way, are located in the top left corner of the screen. So there's some answer choices up there that you can click on. Not the text box, top left corner. Let's see how we do. So again, this is the entire passage, and right now your job is to indicate what is the assumption in this passage. So everybody, we've got 19 participants. I'm only seeing about 7 indicated answers here. So remember, there are letters that you can click that are up there in the top left of your screen. Please give me an indication. Okay, so we've got a majority of people that have figured this out, although we still have a couple of dissenting answers. But it turns out that the only correct assumption out of these two is the first one. Okay, this is not a correct assumption. So what exactly is an assumption? So now let's go ahead and define what we mean by an assumption, because if you don't understand this, then you have a very low probability of being able to do well on Find the Assumption questions. So what is an assumption? Well, it's got to satisfy two criteria. An assumption is a statement that is, first, not explicitly stated in the passage, but here's the most important part. It is necessary for the passage to be valid, for the argument to be valid. In other words, an assumption is something that you need. You need to have it. It's necessary, i.e., people, please don't move things around on the board. Thank you. In other words, if you don't have this assumption, then the argument dies. A lot of people don't realize that it's this strong of a condition. An assumption is something that is absolutely necessary. So let's go back to this passage and let's revisit, now that we know that's what an assumption means, which of these statements must be true? Which of these statements do we need? So I think we can see a few of you thought that both of them were assumptions. Let's revisit that in light of this new realization. Which of these statements do we actually need? Well, we're going from low ratio of type 2 to 1/5ers to you can't be an Olympic sprinter. You need this to be true, otherwise there's no connection between this ratio and whether or not you can be an Olympic sprinter. On the other hand, this statement here, athletes in general, you don't need that. You don't need this to be true. This is too broad. Okay. Now, this would be an excellent answer to a strengthened question, which we'll talk about in a second, but that's not what we're doing right now. So, this is too broad. You don't need this to be true for all athletes, just Olympic sprinters. The difference I want you guys to notice is that if this were a strengthen the argument type question, then number 2 would also be okay. Because if number 2 were true, it would be wonderful. Like if it were true that all athletes require such a ratio, then this argument would work. But it's not an assumption because it's not something that must 100% be true. On the other hand, number 1 is an absolute requirement. If number 1 is not true, then the argument goes by the wayside. So everybody give me a smiley face if you understand, especially those of you who originally picked C. Everybody give me a smiley face if you guys understand the difference here. Smiley face icon on the left. Okay. What about the people who picked C? There's still a couple of you. Okay, good. All right, this is what an assumption is. Make sure that you keep this straight. And here's a word of warning. We're going to start looking at some problems now. Before we do that, a word of warning. All right, note the large difference between find the assumption, for which only the first one of these is true, and strengthen the argument, for which either of them would be an okay answer. This is more difficult than you think, because remember, in critical reasoning, these problems are a mixed bag. They don't present you all the assumptions first, and then all the conclusions, and then all the strengthens and weakens. You get them in an arbitrary order, and they are very thoroughly mixed together. So you must always be aware of the requirements of the problem type. So whichever problem type you're on, you really have to be aware of exactly what that problem type requires of you and what it doesn't. So what we're going to do, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at one assumption question right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the polling so that it's A through E. We're going to look at a question, and then after we look at this one question, I'm going to present you with another very powerful technique for approaching find the assumption questions, and then we'll look at a couple more. So here's the first one. Give me a smiley face. Can everybody see the question? Okay, you guys can see the question. That's good. All right. Remember, please indicate your answer at the top left using the click button. Do not use the text box. Okay, I'm gonna put a timer on the screen. It's a pretty short problem, so I'm gonna give you about 1.5 minutes. Give it a shot. Okay. I think you'll notice that I've temporarily taken away the ability to write on the whiteboard because I don't know who's doing it, but a bunch of people are still, probably by accident, moving items around the whiteboard, and it's not a good thing. So I've just temporarily disabled the ability to move things on the board. All right, everybody indicate an answer, please. If you don't have an answer, then please pick one. We see every answer choice here at least once. But the consensus answer is actually incorrect. Okay, try and take the next 5 or 10 seconds and indicate an answer, please. Okay, here's what we've picked. Here's your statistics. So everything except A has been picked. There are 4 of you that still aren't answering the question. So this is the point at which I give a little mini lecture about this. Remember that, one of these 5 people down here is me. But there are 4 of you who did not answer the question. So we're not going too far into lecturing babysitter mode here. You always have to answer the question. So those of you who didn't produce an answer to this question, remember for the GMAT itself, that's not a viable habit. Like even if you have no idea what the answer is, you can't move on until you answer the question. Okay, so it turns out this is actually the wrong answer, even though it's the consensus favorite, this choice C right here. This is an incorrect answer choice. So let's take a look, because it looks like we can all learn something here. So here's the problem again. Let me resize that text box. Okay, here's the problem again. Does anybody want to get on the mic and explain what their reasoning was? I'll go ahead and break the suspense here. The correct answer is actually E. So anybody who picked E, if you want to jump on the mic, go ahead and raise your hand. There's a button over there on the left that shows a hand with an up arrow next to it. If you want to jump on the mic, if you have a mic, if you want to jump on the mic and explain your reasoning, go ahead and click on the raised hand button, please. Anybody there? There were 5 of you who picked that choice. Okay. Well, let's take a look at C, mostly C versus E, because those are the two most popular choices. Remember, an assumption is a statement that you absolutely need. Okay, let's take a look at C. C states that walking is the only feasible alternative to driving that results in a reduction in pollution. C says that there is no other way to reduce pollution besides walking. All right, now that is not a necessary statement, because that's not what this passage is concerned with. If you look at the passage just says, if people walk whenever they can, then pollution will go down. Right? This doesn't require other means of pollution to be absent. This is just talking about what happens if people do walk. This doesn't require anything to be true in the case that people don't walk. So this doesn't require anything about the presence or absence of other means of reducing pollution. As an analogy, if I say drug X will reduce pain, this certainly doesn't require that drug X be the only way to reduce pain. Okay, I mean, if I just say the drug will make your pain go down, there could certainly be other ways of making your pain go down, but that's irrelevant to this argument. All that matters is what drug X does or doesn't do. Same sort of thing. Right? This argument is only concerned with what walking does versus what walking doesn't do. If there are other ways to reduce pollution, they're irrelevant to this argument in the same way that other ways of reducing pain would be irrelevant to this argument. Okay, give me a smiley face if you guys understand why choice C is incorrect. Okay, now let's look at choice E, which is the correct answer. Remember, always through the lens of being required. Okay. E says, people sometimes drive when it is feasible to walk instead. What this means, C says, basically, it is actually possible for people to switch from driving to walking. That's what this means. People sometimes drive when it's feasible to walk instead. This means there are actually people who could potentially switch from driving to walking. All right, this is totally necessary since the argument depends on people's ability to switch from driving to walking. So, okay, one thing, give me a smiley face if you understand this. The argument says if people would switch from driving to walking, then pollution will go down. That means people have to be able to do that. So, this statement E, that's what that says. It says that there are actually people who could make that switch. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to notice here. The first thing I want you to notice is that this is an awfully bland statement. It's really not, it's not a very interesting statement. You know, so notice, this is a pretty bland statement. In fact, your reaction may have been, well, I already knew that. But you didn't really. See, the problem with these kinds of things is that assumptions are generally unconscious. but they are unconscious assumptions of very very bland things, which is why most people assume them. Because that's how assumptions work in normal human thought processes. Assumptions, for the most part, are not controversial. They're just things that you think you don't even have to say. Okay, so this is what you'd expect. This is what you should expect. All right. Assumptions are generally things that are taken for granted in the argument. So you should not expect them to be terribly interesting or controversial claims. Just make sure you know. You're looking for statements that are very sort of bland and not very extreme. On the other hand, if you have a problem where you're doing to strengthen or weaken the argument, then, ironically, the stronger the statement is, the better it is, potentially as a strengthener or weakener. Here, the weaker the statement it is, the more likely it is to be an assumption. We have a question in the text box which says, it seems as though the choice defends the conclusion. Well, I mean, the choice is going to have to work with the conclusion because that's what an assumption is. An assumption props up the conclusion. So it's like having another premise to the argument. Yeah, it should comprise an actually valid part of an argument because all of it is aimed ultimately towards defending the conclusion at the end. So if that doesn't answer your question, go ahead and type. Yeah, another person in the text box. This is not the 8 p.m. Eastern online class, so you are in the wrong place. You should go back to the Illuminate listings and see if you can find. It should say Manhattan GMAT 9-session course if you're here for a class. Okay, so let's get takeaways from this problem, then I'll present you with a very powerful technique for attacking these, and then we'll revisit this problem. So first, a takeaway. When you're looking for an assumption, weaker or more moderate statements are generally better. On the other hand, when you look for strengthen or weaken, when you're looking for a strengthen or weaken question, more extreme statements are more likely. Or at least more extreme statements are good this time. So it's polar opposites here. You've got, because the difference again is when you look for an assumption, you're looking for a statement that absolutely has to be true. So the more moderate the statement is, the more likely it is to be necessary. On the other hand, strength and weaken, you take the statement for granted. So you assume it's true no matter how obnoxious it is. All right, now let's revisit what an assumption means. Remember what an assumption is. Let's take this statement, and we're going to build a technique off of this statement. If you don't have the assumption, the argument dies. Let's think about that for a second. Assumptions are necessary, which means if the assumption is not true, then the argument cannot hold up. Let's think about that. So let's take this fact, and let's bring this over to another screen. And let's see what we can do with it. So here's the statement that we figured out about assumptions before. All right, we figured out that, remember, if you don't have the assumption, then the argument dies for any valid assumption. what can we do with this? Well, we can actually use this as a criterion for evaluating assumptions. So what we can do is we can use, this fact gives birth to what we can call the reversal method. All right, the reversal method is also discussed in the strategy guide. It has a different name in the strategy guide. Here's what it's called. This is discussed in the strategy guide under the name least extreme negation. The way this works is you use this fact and you use that to actually go through your potential assumptions and evaluate them. So here's how this works. Here's how the reversal method works. Take each potential assumption, reverse it. Reverse it meaning say that the opposite is true, i.e. claim that the opposite is true. And then, what should happen? So go ahead and type in the text box. If I've got the correct assumption and I reverse it, if I say it's not true, then what should happen to the argument? Go ahead and type in the text box. What do you think should happen if I reverse that assumption? Text box. A couple of you are typing. Your commands are starting to show up. Yeah, it should fail. It should undermine the argument. It should make a flawed argument. You guys who are typing in the text box, you guys are absolutely right. Ask yourself, does the argument now fail? Is it invalid? There's two ways that this could come out. Either it fails now or it doesn't fail now. So if the argument now fails, then you got the correct answer. If the argument still works, or, even worse, is stronger now, then you have the wrong answer. So let's apply this method. So let's take the method, let's copy and paste the method. Here's the method. And let's go ahead and look at that problem again that we were just looking at. So here's the problem. And then let's use the reversal method. On choices C versus E. And let's start with E. Remember how it works. You take your potential assumption, you reverse that assumption, and you ask yourself, does the argument now fail? Is the argument invalid? So E says people sometimes drive when it is feasible to walk. So E says basically that there are people who drive but could walk. Does anybody know how to reverse that? Go ahead and type in the text box. What's the reversal of the statement? If this is false, then what does that mean? People who drive, those are not correct reversals. So the one thing that's difficult about this is that sometimes reversals are hard to make. But let's try this. Let's try this in 2 steps. The reversal is is not true that there are people who drive when they could walk. Yeah, the one that was just typed in the text box is the correct reversal, the one typed by a user called Needy. Remember, you've got to be really careful about the way that you reverse these things. It helps to actually just stick these words in front. It is not true that. And then you see what you get out of doing that. So if it is not true that there are such people, then that means there are not such people. So the reversal is therefore, there is nobody who drives when they can walk instead. Or if you go directly off of choice E is people sometimes drive when it is feasible to walk instead. If it is not true that people sometimes drive, then that means they never drive. If that's true, let's see how this affects the argument. If there's nobody out there who drives, if they could just walk, then nothing will happen, because everybody who would walk is already walking. So if this is the case, then the argument fails, because everybody who can walk is already walking. Therefore, the plan will have no effect. So since the argument fails, this must be the correct answer. Faces on that one. Give me a smiley face if you understand this argument. Give me a non-smiley face if you're having some trouble with that. Okay, I'm seeing mostly smileys. It's a good thing. All right, let's take a look. We have one non-smiley face. So if you're the non-smiley face, go ahead and type a question into the text box, and we'll see what we can do for you. All right, text box scans over here. So, all right, and then we'll see if we can incorporate that into the flow of the study hall here. Let's take a look at C. C says there are no ways to reduce pollution other than driving. The reversal of this must be there are other ways to reduce pollution other than walking, sorry. Let me edit that real quick. There are ways to reduce pollution other than walking. Well, this doesn't affect the argument, right? This has no effect on the discussion of whether walking itself will reduce pollution. In other words, if I'm just saying there are alternative ways of reducing pollution, that doesn't have any effect either way on the effect of walking. It's kind of like what we said about drugs. If I have a drug that kills pain, and if you tell me there are 25 other drugs out there that also kill pain, that doesn't have a negative effect on my first claim. I mean, if my drug kills pain, it still does, even if there are 25 other ways to do it too. So this has no effect, so that's an incorrect answer. This one causes the argument to fail if you reverse it, so that's a correct answer. All right, let me see faces here. Again, for the one person who gave me a non-smiley face before, there's a text box here. Whatever reason you have for the non-smiley face, please go ahead and type it into the text box. Let me see faces for this, if you guys understand why the reversal. If you reverse C, it doesn't have any effect on the argument at all. Give me a smiley face if that makes sense. Give me the other face if it doesn't. Okay. Okay. So there's a question in the box. The question is, are there cases when being kind of radical may affect the method? That is a subtlety that we'll get to in a little bit if necessary, because I mean, I don't want to get into degrees of reversals yet, because at least the way the text box was looking before, it doesn't really seem like we're at that point yet, because we had a bunch of sample reversals of that other statement, and most of them are incorrect. So I think we still need to master the basics of this method first. In the vast majority of problems also, that's not really going to be an issue one way or the other. So if you can reverse the statement properly, you're going to be good. So now you've got a couple of weapons in your arsenal. Right? You've got what is an assumption, and then you've also got this fantastic method for evaluating assumptions, which is called the reversal method. So ideally, okay, now the one thing about this reversal method, before we look at another problem, the one thing I want to point out here is this method, all right, there's a pro here, which is that this method is absolutely fantastically powerful. I mean, this is probably the single best method you got for tackling find the assumption problems. On the other hand, this method can be really slow. Okay, because you may have to reverse up to 5 choices. So there's 2 things you've got to get out of this. The first thing is, if you're going to do this, do it right away. And then the other thing is try to eliminate choices first. Because you really, applying the reversal method to 5 separate choices is going to take you a while. So if there are some choices that clearly have nothing to do with what we're talking about, then eliminate those first. And then when you have some contenders left over, try to use this reversal method. So for instance, in this problem, nobody picked A, so you don't have to try the reversal method on A. You can look at A and tell that it doesn't help. So there you go. All right, try your hand at the following problem using all of these methods that you've got. Try this right here. Okay. I'm going to clear out your answers. I'm going to give you about 1.5 minutes again, maybe 1:40. Go for it. Okay, let's try to answer in the next 20 seconds, please. That's been close to 2 minutes already. So let's get some answers, please. Okay, we're still waiting for the last few. There's still 1, 2, 3, 4 of you without answers. Please indicate some sort of answer, even if it requires you to guess. And remember, we have it set so that other people can't see your answer anyway. So remember, for GMAT, guys, you don't have the option not to answer the problem. So don't answer in the text box, please. Remember, there are buttons on the top left where you can click to indicate your answer. All right. Here are the statistics right here, including one more choice of B in the text box. Here are your stats. So this time we nailed this as a group here. About half of you guys, in fact, I'm one of these 21 people, so exactly half of you guys, 10 out of 20, picked the correct answer this time, which is E. All right, so let's take a look. All right, let's see if we can do this directly. Let's actually get rid of the answer choices first and see if we can reason this out. And then after we do that, we'll revisit it and apply the reversal method too. So I'm going to copy and paste the problem. Let's see if we can figure this out. It's not letting me copy and paste. All right. Okay, this is not going to let me copy and paste. That's unfortunate. So let's go ahead and kill the statistics here. Let's use this screen. All right, so let's look at the argument. The argument says, as a result of the lawsuit, advertising firms will stop using imitators. Therefore, advertising costs will rise. So this one you may be able to go ahead and figure out directly. If you look at what they're doing, they're just saying, well, they're going to stop using imitators. There's an assumption here that they're going to start using famous singers. So that's only a necessary consequence if the whole idea of using famous songs is indispensable. But let's go ahead and do the reversal method here. The most popular choices were B and E. So let's use the reversal method on those choices. Let's use the reversal method. For choice B, the reversal of choice B says commercials using famous singers are usually more effective. So, the famous singers are usually more effective. So the reversal of this would be that commercials with famous singers are no more effective. Well, let's see if this has an effect. What's the conclusion of the argument? Like, what is the point of this argument? Go ahead and type in the text box. This argument is aimed at proving what point? Yeah, the argument is aimed at proving that costs are going to go up. Okay, the argument is only concerned with the cost of the ads, and then also use of imitators versus not use of imitators, like the cost of it. The cost of imitators versus non-imitators. And then the only other thing we're concerned with is the use of famous songs. In particular, the effectiveness is actually not mentioned anywhere in the entire problem. So therefore, this is going to have no effect. In fact, you don't even, if you have something like this where you're completely out of scope, you actually don't even need to use the reversal method to figure that out. But if you do, it may make it more clear. Because, I mean, if something is really out of scope, then if you reverse it, it'll still be out of scope. But in this case, the reversal method may simply highlight that fact. But effectiveness of the ads has nothing to do with anything that's here. And remember, don't fall prey to the same thing that you're trying to look for here. The whole point of find the assumption problems is for you to realize connections that are being made even though they shouldn't be being made. So if you pick a choice like B, you're actually falling through victim to that same sort of thing. You're making connections that you're not really allowed to be making here. So the takeaway from this answer choice is one of the wrong answer choices. The takeaway is when you find assumptions, you need to stay within the scope of the argument. Let's look at choice E. Choice E says that the advertising industry will still use famous songs. What's the reversal of this? Go ahead and type in the text box, please. What's the reversal of that statement? The reversal of the statement is the industry will no longer use famous songs. Well, if this is true, then the argument dies a horrible death. Because if this is true, then we don't need the famous singers. If this is true, then we have no use for the famous singers. Therefore, we don't have to hire them. Therefore, costs will not rise. Argument is dead. So this is the correct answer. Notice the reversal method is really, really good at pointing this stuff out. Because it's easier for most people, because here's why the reversal method is so effective. Right? When you have a find the assumption problem, find the assumption is hard. Because find the assumption asks you to basically take things that you would unconsciously assume anyway and identify them. You have to basically probe into unconscious reasoning. If you use the reversal method, though, that's no longer the case. Because if you use the reversal method, then it's let me give you something and you tell me how it will affect the argument. That is now a very conscious thought process. What happens if the industry stops using famous songs? What happens if the commercials don't have any more effectiveness? Now you're no longer identifying unconscious assumptions. Now you're just saying what will happen if this is true, which is a much more normal human thought process than finding assumptions in. So that's why this reversal method is such a powerful thing. So, there. There's a question in the text box, but can't famous singers sing non-famous songs? Well, they could, but this argument doesn't work anymore. Because this argument depends on we have to hire famous singers. If this is not true, then we don't have to hire them. You know, we still could hire them to sing non-famous songs, but that would not make sense. The point is that the argument is now broken because we don't. The argument needs us. The argument says we have to hire these guys now. This is not true anymore. Any questions? Okay, some people are typing. Give me a smiley face if. Okay. Choice C. Someone's asking about choice C. The original versions of some well-known songs are unavailable for use. The original versions of some well-known songs are unavailable for use in commercials. So the reversal of this statement would be the original versions of, if this is not true, then that means all of the original versions are available. But the original versions are going to have been done by famous singers because they're the original version. So this actually plays, if you reverse this, it actually plays into the argument rather than working against it. Because if you're using original versions, then you are still using famous singers. So that'll still make your cost go up. So if you reverse C, it actually goes with, not against, the flow of the argument. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. So smiley face if you guys are ready to move on to something else. Okay. All right, let's look at a different type of question now. Let's turn our attention to strengthen and weaken type questions. And in particular, let me just throw one on the board. Find it for you here. All right. Try your hand. This problem is from GMAT Prep software. This is a strengthen question. Go ahead and try your hand at it. And let's see what we can do. Again, I'll clear out your answers. Please indicate A through E in the top left of the window. Thank you. Okay, sorry, the mic was off. Okay, go ahead and please answer the problem. There are about 7 or 8 of you who have not yet answered the problem. Okay, let's start taking a look here. This is a strengthen or weaken question. Now, let's have a discussion of this really quickly, then we'll move back to the question. All right, so when you have a strengthen or weaken question, one huge difference is that the correct answer must, at least somewhat, venture outside the scope of the immediate argument, i.e., introduce something new. Because think about what you're being asked to do. There are 2 things to notice here. The first is that it says, if true. That's a monumentally huge difference because now, unlike finding assumptions, we are not looking anymore at things that must be true. We're just looking at things that whatever we tell you, we're just assuming that it's true. So notice that you no longer are constrained to picking things that have to be true. Okay, this means there's an upside and a downside. The upside to this is more like normal human brain thinking. But the downside is always a downside, is that there's a much greater variety of possible answers. Because remember, with finding the assumption, you pretty much have to stick with what you're talking about already. So with that one about driving and walking to work, we had to stick to the topic of just walking versus driving. So that one about other methods of reducing pollution, out of scope. The other question we looked at with the other find the assumption question that we just saw involving the famous singers, we had to stick to the topics about commercials and well-known songs and renditions and stuff like that. With strengthen and weaken, we're allowed to venture outside the immediate scope. And in fact, we have to. Because otherwise, you can't strengthen. I mean, you can't strengthen an argument by just reiterating the talking points that are already there. And you also can't weaken an argument by reiterating what's already there either, because you wouldn't weaken it. I mean, those statements would already be there. So Let's keep that in mind. Right? Remember that going outside the scope here is okay. Right? Unlike find the assumption, remember, unlike find the assumption, you are not trying to pick something that must be true. Instead, whatever they say, you just assume it's the case and see what sort of effect it has on the argument. If you try to answer these as though they were find the assumption problems, you will get them all wrong. Because that's not what we're doing here. Remember, these two words, if true, are crucial. These two words show you that no matter what these choices say, you're like, okay, fine, that's a fact. Let me see what effect it has. Now, let me give you the single best thing that you can do here. The best thing you can do on strengthen and weaken is simplify the argument. What I mean by that is you should try your best to boil the argument down to one or two statements. This can be hard, but this forces you to figure out the crux of the argument. It forces you to figure out what the actual true emphases are in the argument. Let's try to do that here. Because all these statements about excavation, we don't really care about excavation. Excavation of the ancient city of Korean revealed a pattern of debris and collapsed buildings, typical of towns devastated by earthquakes. What does that basically mean? That basically just means, okay, we know that Korean was destroyed by an earthquake. Archaeologists have hypothesized that the destruction was due to a major earthquake known to have occurred near the island in AD 365. So if we simplify, a simplified argument has the following format. The only premise we've got is Korean was destroyed by an earthquake. Therefore, conclusion, it must have been the earthquake that happened in year 365. Everybody give me a smiley face if you follow this boiled down version of the argument, because that's really, there's a lot of words here, but that's effectively all this says. So, therefore, we can see there's a big problem here. It's not as obvious when there are as many words surrounding it, but we're somehow getting from an earthquake to the one that happened in 365. That's a pretty big deal there. I mean, that would be like saying, you know, I had a relative who died, therefore he must have died of this particular disease. That's a big thing. So, to strengthen this, I mean, let's see how these things affect it. The most popular, almost all of you picked either B or C. So let's investigate B and C. B pins the date, B pinpoints the date at year 365. Because this says there were tons of coins from before 365 and there were no coins at all after 365. You know, like basically the coins suddenly stopped at year 365. This is strong evidence that something cataclysmic happened in exactly year 365. That's a strengthener. If you look at what C does, C just says that's evidence. So it basically just says that there was an earthquake in 365. The problem is that doesn't really help, because that's already, in fact, this doesn't strengthen the argument at all, because it's known to have occurred. So, but this is already known to have occurred. So this is no help. In particular, make sure you don't fall for traps like this, okay? If you reiterate something that is already known, this is not a strengthening. Make sure you know that. If two people say a fact, that doesn't make it more of a fact than if one person says it. So this is not a strengthener. This is no help. This doesn't strengthen. So the correct answer to this problem is B, like boy. But the main takeaway that I want you guys to get from this is our technique here. The best thing you can do for strengthen or weaken problems is simplify the argument. If you can, try to get the argument down to a single line or two. It's not going to be a terribly easy thing to do, but if you can successfully do it, you know, and especially when you see lots of worriness surrounding these statements, like all this stuff about excavation of the city, you don't really care about excavation. Like, why are they telling me this? Okay, well, they're telling me this, that's evidence that there was an earthquake. Okay. Any questions about this problem? We always have to look new info. GMAT in a week, do you have a mic? If you have a mic, I might have you jump on the mic because I'm not really understanding what you typed here. So, do you have a microphone? Yes, no? First, okay, there's a button over there. I have to click off, then you have to click on. It's a button with a microphone picture on it. So try to click on it and then talk.
Run. Yeah, I was asking if, because now we're looking new info, right? The coins were minted after 365. It's new info. Choice C, it doesn't give us new info. It just restates what we have in the argument. So that's what you refer when saying that something must strengthen the conclusion.
Okay, I'll respond to what I think you're asking me. I think you're asking me about what we've already said here. Yeah, your correct answers have to go outside the scope, at least somewhat, because if they don't, those are not strengtheners. Okay, I mean, make sure you know this. If you when you find the assumption, you're looking for assumptions. Assumptions are things that are encoded in your argument already, and so they can't go outside the scope. Strengtheners, remember, you don't have to worry about in or out of scope at all when you're doing strengthen questions, because it says this. Okay, if true is basically permission to go out of scope. Right? These two words are basically permission to go outside the scope of the argument. And because you're strengthening the argument, I mean, strengtheners, have to add on to what is here. So yes, you must pick things that are not already part of the argument. And that's why C is not a strengthener, because C is already there. I mean, C is a fact that we already know, and so it doesn't help us if somebody just tells us this again. It's redundant. Okay, give me a smiley face if that helps. I know someone typing. Okay. There's one of you who has been, I think it's Dave, you've had some text in your text box window for like the last 5 minutes. Okay, you're not typing a question. All right, so the takeaways here are this. Try to simplify the argument. Try to get it down to a statement or two. And then once you do that, don't worry about scope as much. Just see how things affect the argument. So try this. This one generally tends to be a little bit harder for people, but I think you guys are up to the challenge. So give it a shot. This is from GMAT Prep. I'll give you just shy of 2 minutes to do it. Give it a shot. All right. Go ahead and indicate an answer, please, in the next 15 or 20 seconds. Thank you. Okay. While people are finishing up, does anybody have a simplified version of the argument that they want to type into the text box? Some of these things are background statements, and some of them are relevant to the actual argument. So let's see what you guys come up with. Let's see if you guys can come up with a simplified argument. I'll give you a little while to type that into the box. Okay, so you guys are starting to get there. Let me type some of what you guys are typing as you do it. I'll wait till a couple more of your simplified arguments show up on the screen. Remember the goal here. Let's simplify the argument. But when you simplify the argument, by the way, you've always got to have at least one premise and at least one conclusion. You can't just give the conclusion. So if you want a template to fill in, you should have a blank, therefore a blank. So let's go ahead and fill this in. Yeah, okay, the one that Alina typed into the window there is nice and compact, so let's do that. The conclusion is the millipedes, rubbing the millipedes, must protect against mosquitoes. The evidence on which this is based is they only rub the mosquitoes in the winter, in the rainy season. And also there are lots of mosquitoes in the rainy season. Okay. By the way, also, one thing about this problem is that, yeah, so you guys, I want to comment on a couple of the arguments that are in that text box, but we'll do that in a second. The first thing I want to do is point to the prompt. Most useful to determine in order to evaluate the argument. Let me tell you what that is, just to make sure you know. That's basically code words for strength and weaken. This is basically code for strengthen or weaken. Because that's what, in order to evaluate, means. It means evaluate the strength of the argument. How strong or weak is the argument? I mean, the only difference between these and strengthen or weaken questions is that these don't tell you which way it goes. Like, these kinds of things start with the word whether. And so, therefore, they can go either way. But now that's why they can't ask you which one strengthens, because they would have to say yes or no to this whether question. So, if this were a strengthen question, it would be something like, you know, yes, they are only available during rainy season, instead of whether. Make sure you know, if any of you like to classify questions, and you should like to classify questions, because that's every classification of question demands a different strategy. So you should be classifying questions. But if you do, then make sure you know that these fall under the umbrella of strength and weaken questions. So, okay. Some of you, I want to comment on a couple of these simplified arguments. A couple of you are going a little bit too far. One of you, as a premise, put capuchins use millipedes to repel against parasites. That's not what this says, okay? Because that implies that these guys are, I mean, that implies that they already know that they're mosquito repellent, which is, that's a circular argument. That's already your conclusion. This just says they rub a bunch of millipedes in and there's a chemical that happens to repel mosquitoes. It does not say that that's the purpose why the monkeys are doing it. That's actually the conclusion of the argument. That's not a premise. So, this is just a correlation. In fact, if any of you like to classify types of arguments, you can notice that what we have on our hands here is an argument where correlation is mistaken for causation. That green box there, that's just a correlation. But then this is causation. So this is a common type of misstep that arguments make. If you realize that, then more on that in a second. But let's see how this affects. So let's look at D and E are pretty much the only answers that lots of people pick. So let's analyze those. All right. This argument, basically the argument says because they rub the mosquitoes. So if there is some other reason for this correlation, the argument will be compromised. So let's take a look at how D and E affect that. First, D says this means that they can't get the millipedes at any other time. How does it affect this argument? Well, that drastically weakens this argument, if this is true. Because look at the simplified argument. We have a connection between they only rub the mosquitoes in the rainy season, and we're attributing that to the mosquitoes. But if this is true, then that doesn't have to be the case anymore. If this is true, then the rubbing probably doesn't have anything to do with mosquitoes anymore. It's probably just because they can't get them. It's probably because that's the only season when they can rub the mosquitoes. So that's going to have a substantial weakening effect on this argument. So that's a strong answer choice. let's look at choice E in the same regard. Whether secretions of any other insects contain chemicals that repel the mosquitoes. Well, let's see what this does. This doesn't affect the correlation that we're looking at. And it's not relevant to what we're talking about. Remember, what you've got to do is you've got to stay with the simplified argument here. The simplified argument is they happen to rub these mosquitoes, they happen to rub these millipedes. Let me correct that, I should say millipedes. Millipedes, sorry. I shouldn't say mosquitoes. Okay. The argument is just about this correlation between rubbing these guys in the rainy season and there being lots of mosquitoes in the rainy season. Choice E doesn't really affect that argument in any meaningful way. So, if you look at that, it's irrelevant. It might affect other things that have to do with these considerations. For instance, but you have to add more stuff in there because you would have to make it relevant to this seasonal argument. For example, if choice E said something like other species that are not available during the rainy season have these chemicals, then that would affect us here. Because if we had other species that were only available out of season, then that could be a factor. But even if there are other insects like this, unless it has some sort of bearing on what we observe about the seasons, it doesn't really help us or hurt us. And only simplifying the argument is really going to help you figuring that out. If you don't have a simplified argument, it's very difficult to tell what goes on here. All right, let me see faces here. Let me see how you guys feel about these explanations. Give me a smiling face if they make sense to you. Give me the other face if they don't. Okay, that's pretty good. Looks like we're all smiles for now. If there are any questions, go ahead and type them into the text box. But if not, what I want to do is just show you a concluding slide to wrap up what we've learned today. So, and the helping verbs, again, we're going to have to defer until the 18th. Because we're running up on a time limit here. So what have we learned today? So we've looked at two departments of critical reasoning. The first department we've looked at is find the assumption. In that department, we've learned that assumptions are things that need to be true. Okay, so don't just pick strengtheners. Okay, make sure that the statement is necessary. And if you need to go back to that example that we started off the class with, then you can do that. Okay, the other thing we've learned about assumptions, which is the most powerful thing for sure that you can know about them, is that you can use the reversal method. Okay, remember how that works? The steps of the reversal method are take each potential assumption, reverse it. If you have trouble with reversing it, you can put the following words in front. It is not true that. And then see if it destroys the integrity of the argument. Okay, if the argument is destroyed, then you got the correct answer. If the argument is not destroyed or is strengthened, then it's an incorrect answer. So, yeah. What we've learned about strength and weaken, here's a recap of what we learned about those departments. Strength and weaken. Two things. First of all, it's perfectly okay for these answers to be outside the direct scope of the argument. But also, the best weapon you have is to simplify the argument. When you do that, try for one line, therefore one line. And then only apply the choices to your simplified argument. I mean, if you do this, you'll suddenly discover that many statements that seem relevant are really not relevant. So this is your main points that we've learned today. All right, any quick questions in the text box that you might have? I'll try to address them real quickly before we bid you goodbye. Again, this last agenda item that we talked about, this one right here, sentence correction, placement of helping verbs. I know this is a topic that's actually been deferred from one earlier study hall as well, but unfortunately we're going to have to defer it again. So this topic will be deferred until the study hall on the 18th. Yes, there's another class on the 18th. That one is going to be 3 hours later than this one. That one is going to be held at 7:30 Pacific time, if I remember correctly. It's either 6:30 or 7:30, but go ahead and check the website. The new class time should be posted within a couple of days when they take this one off. So yes, there is a class 2 weeks from now at a slightly different time, at a slightly later time. Someone's asking about the 128. Some people were asking about this in the forum as well. We didn't have a class on January 28th. These things aren't weekly. There's one class that took place on January 21st, which is not yet posted because there were some technical difficulties. But we did get permission from Illuminate to convert some of the old files into MPEG movie files. So once that happens, we will be able to display the January 21st class, but not before that. As for January 28th, we didn't have a class. So it's every other week. It's not every week. Okay, other questions real quick. If not, if you don't have other questions, you can go ahead and quit. You can quit by just quitting the entire application. Thank you for coming, appreciate it. And if you, we're going to go ahead and log you guys out in the next couple of minutes. If we actually don't send the slides. We actually, someone's asking about sending slides. We don't do that, although the recordings of the classes are posted publicly. So you can have, and you don't even have to be logged in or anything like that. You can access the class no matter who you are. But we don't give away slides. That's just our company's policy that I've been informed of. So, yeah. Okay, the takeaway slide is here. I'll leave this on the screen for the next minute or two, and then I'll start logging you guys out. I'll handle questions out of the text box. I'm going to stop recording now, but I'll keep answering questions for another couple of minutes if necessary.